The next thing I wanted to go over is something you can do to practice your knife skills, whether you're in your backyard at home or you're out in the wilderness and you want to practice your knife skills, but you don't really know what to make. You can make trap triggers, you can make all sorts of different stuff, but this is a way to combine a lot of different techniques into one project that you can use to compare different knives. It's a good testing standard for different knives, even different building materials. In this case, I have a piece of dead pine. This is not my preferred material. I prefer something in this area in the Rockies. I really like willow scrub. That works great. It's a very soft wood. You can leave the bark on and it makes really nice notches. And that's what I would use for most things, but obviously you don't always have access to that. In the area I am, I have pine, and so I can make it using pine. It's called a tri-stick. I believe Morris Kahansky kind of came up with the idea, but I don't know that for sure. I learned it from Joshua Inyart from the Gray Bearded Green Beret. He showed it in one of the classes I went to, and I thought it was very neat. And then I've seen a lot of other people talk about it, and I believe it goes back to Morris Kahansky. At least I know he used it. I don't know if he invented it. But it's a great technique of combining multiple different notches and different carving techniques onto one piece of wood. And if you're using something like willow, or a softer wood with a much more fibrous bark than pine, you could strip the bark off in long pieces and you could use that bark to practice a reverse wrap cordage. You can, when you're doing like the square reduction, round reduction that I'll show in a minute, you could use those little fine shavings and try to make them as small as possible, and then use those shavings and see if you can line them with your ferro rod. So in one stick, you could practice your cordage, you could practice your knife safety and your knife handling and building different notches. You can also practice building a fire. So in one stick, you can get a lot of practice using your knife and other techniques down. As far as how long you want it, well, that really depends on how small you want your notches to be. For starting out, I recommend something that's like, I would say like, if I had my fingers closed from like my fist to between my elbow and armpit. Something like that would be a good size. Any smaller, I've seen them made where they're like that big, and that really attributes to someone's ability to use their knife finely and delicately. But something, mosquito in the mouth. Nice. But something that can be challenging at first is not breaking these as you're making them. So I recommend starting with something about the length, like I said earlier, and about the diameter of, I don't know, maybe like your thumb, depending on the size of your thumb, but definitely no thinner than, I would say, like maybe like a Sharpie size. But I recommend something like a large Sharpie size. I don't know, maybe like if you held a penny up to it, that'd be a good size. But it really depends on your skill level and what you want to try. So with this, you can do a combination of really any notches and stuff you find useful. These are a lot of the notches that I learned from Josh when I took his course, and I know they're a lot of the same ones that Moores used on his. But it really, whatever you find useful in your, I guess, daily bushcraft life. So starting off, a good place to start would be something like a square reduction. Where what this is you're basically trying to take a round piece of wood and reduce it into a square size. So I would say starting, you want to leave yourself a handle. You pick an end. I'm going to pick the thinner end because I want to save the thicker ends for making the notches so I don't risk breaking it. But you want to leave yourself a handle. So basically don't make a notch anywhere past like your fist, like right here. And then, so on this end, I'm going to start, I would say, probably like 1 inch to 2 inches from the end, so I don't risk breaking it. But basically with the square reduction, it helps having a sturdy anvil that you can use your wood against. But with the square reduction, you're basically going to start out, and you can do this using a baton and pound it in, or you can just work it if you want to take your time, work it slowly. I've made these with nothing but my knife. To save time, I'm going to use this. Basically, you're going to want to pound it in, not very far. You don't want to risk breaking through, because you're also going to have to do it on the other side. And you're basically going to repeat that process on all 4 sides of this. So I'll go ahead and do that. Just a couple taps to give myself a nice stop cut. And it can be challenging at first to be able to get that to go in a complete circle. Oftentimes when you're beginning, you'll do a stop cut here, and by the time you get around to the other side, you'll be down here. So getting those ends to line up can be challenging. It takes practice. That's one of the reasons you do this. Is it's quick, easy. It takes 1 stick, and you can practice it. So if you mess up, don't worry about it. You can always try again. And then what I'll do is I'll repeat that same process about 1 to 2 inches down. Alright, so now that I have those stop cuts, and what those are for, and we'll be using those a lot, is basically as you're carving, it will keep you from continuing past that stop cut that I put around there. And that way you don't blow the material out the end, and you can keep that notch or that particular thing you're doing within those boundaries. So then what I would do, and I use a lot of a thumb assisted technique here, but basically I'm going to start reducing this material down. We'll see how well this wood works. I know there's a lot of knots in it. And you want to be careful, because just because those stop cuts are there doesn't mean if you hit hard enough it's going to split out the end. And I usually try to make these look nice. Keep in mind when you're making the square reduction, you want it to be square. So don't just start whittling down all the way around, because then you'll have a round reduction, which we'll do here in a minute. So if you mess up, you can turn it into a round reduction. But basically what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be working this at 3 sides, or 4 sides, sorry. So I'm going to do front and back, and then side to side. And I'm just going to keep continuing that process until that material is reduced and it's a square. So basically I'll be able to feel, you don't want it to be offset. Like if I started carving here, it wouldn't be square. So I feel with my finger, figure out, alright, make sure the side that I already flattened out is at the bottom. I'm going to go directly above that, get my finger out of the way. And this doesn't have to be anything fast. It's not about how fast you do it, it's about what it looks like when you're done, and making sure you have a complete product when you're finished and not break it halfway in the middle because you're trying to move too fast. I would recommend, if you're starting, make a stick that's a bit longer. That way you have a handle on both ends. I have a little bit of one here, but it can make it challenging to hold on to. I've done it enough without that handle that I'm okay, but I recommend having that handle on both ends. That way you can get good technique and you don't risk hurting yourself. So I have square reduction on basic, or a flat reduction on both sides. So now I'll move to the sides that still have material and start flattening those out. And I'll repeat this process all the way around until I have a square. Now I have a square reduction. So it's square on all 4 sides. It doesn't have to be perfectly square, but it's not round. You can continue making this as small as possible. For the sake of time, I'm not going to keep going. Plus, because this is dry wood, it will break easier, so I don't want to thin out the material too much. Like I said, I do really prefer using like a willow scrub, something green. It works a lot better, it's a lot easier to carve, but you're not always carving green wood, so it's good to build practice with both. So, but yeah, that's a square reduction. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to do a round reduction. So, going about an inch down from the square reduction, we're going to do the same stop cuts all the way around. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit further because I have some knots right here that will make it difficult to be able to cut through. I'm going to go just below those, right about here, do those same stop cuts all the way around. Alright, so now that I got those stop cuts cut all the way around, I'll just start reducing this down, same as I did up here, but I'm not so worried about it being square. Now I can just work all the way around because I'm just trying to reduce the material but maintain the round shape. So it's a lot easier. And you will notice as I'm doing this, I'll be using multiple different carving techniques and slices that I touched on earlier. But as you can see, this reduces material a lot quicker. As you're carving this direction, once you are done and you want to start carving this direction, don't hold behind the knife and try carving towards yourself. You can slip and cut yourself. Turn the material around and maintain that cutting away from your fingers. Again, what is your backstop? What is it going to hit if the material breaks away and your knife slips? In this case, air. In this case, my hand. So keep that in mind. Always know your backstop. And then you just continue this process until you get a nice round reduction. As you're doing it, you'll be getting these little feathers. That's what you can use to make your feather sticks, to make a fire. But if you're just trying to get rid of them, what you can do is after you've carved and you have some of those feathers, you stick your knife right where that stop cut was, put it on your backstop, and just kind of rotate the stick, and it will cut through those. So I have a square reduction, a round reduction. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a square notch. And you don't have to do any of these in any particular order. It's just basically what I can remember. And so for a square notch, rather than going all the way around like we have been on these, now we're just going to be working on one side. I recommend alternating which side you do it on, so that way you don't weaken all one side of your material. It helps with keeping it from breaking. But for a square notch, basically I'm going to make two stop cuts about an inch apart, and then I'm just going to carve out a square material like I did here, a little deeper. Rather than going on all four sides, I'm just going to do one side. So stop, cut, cut out the material in the middle. And again, I'm going to try to avoid any knots in the wood. And when you're making these notches, I recommend not going any further than the center of the wood. Depending on the wood type, and you'll have to experiment with what's in your area, you might have to be shallower or you can be deeper, but I really wouldn't recommend going any deeper than the center of your material. And you can make these notches as small as you want as you get more experience, but I don't recommend trying to start out going small. Set yourself up for success, and then you can increase your skill level as you do it. And basically what I'm going to be doing is I'll work one side, turn the material around, work the other side, and I'm trying to make a flat, basically a square notch. So I'll have two right angle ends and then a right angle bottom. And this is one of the reasons, like I spoke about earlier, that I don't like a very fat knife, because it's hard to get down in there and do small little tasks like this. And you don't want to have a separate knife that you use just for your feather sticks and then one knife that you use out in the woods, because you want the knife that you are practicing with to be the same knife you would use in an emergency or in your daily life out in the wilderness. So that way you're used to it. And like I've practiced enough with different knives that it doesn't really matter which knife I pick up, I can kind of get the work done. But don't have your special wood carving knife that you use for making these to make really pretty Instagram worthy tri-sticks, and then you have the knife that you actually carry out in the woods and you don't ever use that for small stuff like this. Make sure the knife you carry can do small tasks like this, because these are the same tasks you would be doing for different trap triggers and different small chores around camp. Alright, so that's a square notch. I'm not going to go any deeper so I don't compromise the integrity of the wood. But, like I said, flat side, flat bottom. Next, I'm going to do what's called a saddle notch. And this looks like a saddle. So in this case, I'm going to have angled sides and then kind of a swooping bottom. So again, I'm going to go here because no notches. Well, and for this one, you don't put your stop cuts on either end. You want to put your stop cut in the middle. And you'll see why here in a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and make that stop cut. And like I said earlier, opposite side. So that way I don't weaken one whole side of my wood. So now what you do is you cut from both angles towards that. You don't want a super steep angle. We'll do that later for a V-notch. But for this one, you want to do more shallow swooping angles, because you want it to look like a saddle. I don't want to sit in a saddle that looks like this. I want to sit in a saddle that's more swooping. So as you can see, try to get this as close to you guys as possible. As I'm going, I'm doing more of a down and swoop. And then I'll rotate around. And it's starting to take shape. You can see it has swooping edges. There's no flat end or edge to it. And as you get more experience with this, you can make these a lot faster. But there's your saddle notch. It has swooping edges down to a center point, but they're not straight edges. Also called a log cabin notch. But technically that could be a log cabin notch too, depending on what style of log cabin you're building. So a saddle notch is a more accurate representation that I think everyone would understand. So then, turning the stick over again, going here, I'm going to make a V-notch. So for this, I'm going to make my stop cut in the center again, but when I make this, I want my angles to be not straight down, but at like a 45-degree angle, maybe a little steeper depending on how steep you want that V, straight down, so that way you have a V versus a saddle. Now that I have that stop cut in the center where my notch is going to be, I'm going to start cutting at an angle like this, at like a 45-degree angle down towards that stop cut. Keep in mind your backstop, make sure your finger doesn't move up so much that if the wood to break, and your knife wouldn't go into your hand. So I'm not going to make it any deeper than that because I don't want to break the wood. But that would be a V-notch, where you have two about 45-degree angle sides down to a center point. And you can see I'm at the heartwood there. You can just barely see it poking through, and that's an indicator of you don't want to go any deeper than that. So then, rotating the stick over again, I'm going to make a what is referred to as either like a beak notch or a pot hanger notch. I like pot hanger notch because that's what you use it for. It also can be used like when you're making an atlatl and you're making the end point where the dart stick, the back of the dart sticks into when you make the atlatl thrower. But it's basically what you're doing is you're making a, it looks like a bird's beak. So for that, you want to create an X pattern with your stop cuts. So I'm going to be making one stop cut here and one stop cut here. And then as you can see, an X pattern. So then what you do is the top of that X, you don't ever want to carve there. You're going to be carving from this end up towards that notch, or that, basically that peak there. And you're going to cut out the bottom and the sides of that X, but leave the top. Hopefully that makes sense. As I go along, I'll show you guys. This is probably the most complicated notch, but it's really useful. So as you can see, as I'm going along, I'm cutting down here and then I'm rotating my knife to get rid of those sides. So when I'm done, I have what looks like a beak. So I'll continue taking this down, the sides and this end, and then until I have a pronounced beak there, and then I'll carve out a little bit underneath so I have a bit of space underneath it. You want to be very careful with this one that you don't exert too much force and you blow through and break that tip off. That tip can be pretty fragile, especially on dead wood, like I'm using here. So taking your time, doing it well. Anything worth doing is worth doing well. Doesn't mean you can't make a mistake, but you don't want that mistake to come because you were too impatient to take your time and try. So as you can see here, it slopes down. I have the peak right there, or the beak, I guess, and then it's cut away on either side. So it does look like a bird's beak. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out just a little bit underneath that beak to give a place for the bail of your pot to sit. So as you can see there, there's now basically a little notch within the notch. And that's for, you can make another notch that I'll show you here in a minute on this end, and you could take the bail of your cooking pot and it could hook in there. Obviously you wouldn't want it this long, but you could actually make a series of these. Well, no, that wouldn't work because this end would be in the fire, but you could make a series of notches up here to adjust the height of it. But the bail of your pot could hang in that V notch, and a good way to see if it works is take your pot, the bail, and stick it on there and wiggle around, make sure it doesn't fall off. I don't have my pot with me today, but that is a beak notch or pot hanger notch. But again, it can also be used for an atlatl to hold your dart on the end of your thrower. If you were to do that, you would want to make this angle a bit shallower, so that way the dart can sit in there. Like this, it would be sticking up at a weird angle, so you want the dart to be able to lay relatively flat on your thrower. But for this scenario, for this example, I will just leave it like that. But that is your beak notch or pot hanger notch. So then, rotating to the other side again, I'm going to make a stake notch. So for this, I'm going to make a stock cut. This is also referred to as like a 7 notch, because it kind of looks like a 7. I like stake notch because, again, that's the primary use that I use it for, but it could also be used for, you've probably seen them, but if not, it's basically 2 stake notches that hook on each other, and you use it for like a trap trigger for a spring pull snare, where you have the like a sapling bent over with your snare attached, and one end is attached to one stick with a 7 notch or a stake notch, and the other one has another stake notch, and that is actually a stake in the ground, and you can just barely hook those ends together, and then when an animal gets caught on that snare, it'll pop, and the spring pull will tighten the noose. Very easy trap to make, but for what I do, because trapping isn't really, or primitive trapping isn't legal in my area, I use it primarily for tent stakes. But for this, like I said, stock cut, and then you'll cut just towards that stock cut. You won't cut on the other side. So now that I have my stop cut, I'll start cutting towards it. Again, whenever I have those feathers cut down along the stop cut, cut them off. Alright, there you go. So you have a sloping angle, kind of like half of a saddle notch, up to just a straight stop cut. And that way, if you were to pound your tent stake into the ground, your cordage from your tie out would hook into this, and you would pound it in at the ground and keep it from slipping off. Another variation of this is called a latch notch, where basically it swoops down, then there's a flat surface, and then the stop cut. I don't really do that much because it looks almost identical to a stake notch, but that is another variation used in some trap triggers. So those are all the notches I'm going to talk about. A couple other things you can do to this stick. Obviously, you could add any of your own notches that you prefer and you use. These are really some basic ones that will be used in lots of different trap triggers. I use them relatively often. Anything else I've never really had much of a use for, but I'm sure there's lots of different notches out there that you can use. So, one thing I'm going to do now is I am going to show you how to essentially do a couple things on the ends to demonstrate a couple skills. So on this end, it's pretty ugly looking, and I want to clean that up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically point this. So if this was your tent stake and you didn't have all these other notches and you have your stake notch up here, you want your other end to be pointed so you can drive it into the ground. For that, super simple. You just point it. Same as like if you're sharpening like a carpenter's pencil. You basically just start working your way around, reducing that down to a point on one end. It's not complicated. I'm not going to make this a steep point because I don't have a lot of material down there. But a pointed stick is useful for all sorts of things. Probably one of the original hunting implements, besides a club maybe. You could fire harden this and make like small game arrows with it. All sorts of different uses for a pointed stick. You could even fire harden it, char it, and use it as a pencil. I've done that before. But essentially, you're just reducing it down to a point. So as you can see there, If it was a tent stake, I'd probably make it a much steeper angle and start up here and work my way down. But if the ground's really rocky, you might want a more blunted point like this so your tip doesn't break off. But that's a pointed end. On a thinner stick, you could use it to skewer meat. All sorts of different uses for a pointy stick. Alrighty, so then on this end, I want to talk about how with a knife you can cut a piece of wood. If it's green wood, like a sapling, you could bend it over, put pressure on those fibers, and then press down with your knife, and it will split those fibers and cut very easily. But it doesn't leave a very clean cut. And if you're wanting to make something that doesn't look like you hacked at it with a sharp rock, you want to make something like what's called a rose cut or a beaver chew. I like beaver chew, but some people like rose cut better. Basically, what you're going to be doing with this is you're going to, and this is how you can make a flush cut on a piece of stick or a piece of wood. Obviously, you can see here, I just quickly broke this off, and that doesn't look very pretty. It's not very useful for an usable end of a tool or implement. So you're going to start working, doing small little, let's see if I can get this in there, little cuts into the wood all the way around. As you can see there, I'm starting to have all these little feathers, and I'm working my way into this wood. And it looks like, kind of like what a beaver does, is they just chew their way around the tree. And underneath all those feathers, I'm reducing the wood. And I'll just continue that process all the way around, making small little cuts. And you can do this much faster if you're in a hurry. But for something like a tri-stick, you have no reason to be in a hurry. You can take your time, make it nice. And then once you get it reduced all the way down, there's just a little bit left in there. What you can do is you can just break it. So you just wiggle it back and forth. And as you can see, it left a little bit on one end, but the other end kind of looks, if it was greener wood, these feathers would be a bit bigger and it would look like a rose. You can kind of see it there. It's not a great example, but on this end it is almost a flush cut. What I can do then is I can take my knife and I can flush it out. So now I have a flush cut piece of wood. However, if this was a tent stake, you wouldn't want that to be flush, because as you hammer on it with your rock or baton or whatever to get it into the ground, it's going to start splitting out and mushrooming. So what you do then is you bevel it. And for doing that, basically you're trying to make it kind of look like an eraser on a pencil. So imagine this like your big pencil. This is the writing end. This is the eraser. You want it to kind of look like a chewed on eraser, I guess you could say. So I'm going to start working around the edges, beveling it out. As you can see here, I'm just beveling that end. And then you start looking for high spots. And you just start beveling it out. So now I have a beveled end. And that, when you hammer on it with your baton, won't split out. It won't mushroom. It will drive cleanly into the ground as long as there's no compromise in the integrity of the stick, like a crack. But that's essentially a basic tri-stick. Each one of these can be used for a different purpose, and they can be scaled way up, like if you're building a log cabin, scaled way down if you're building really tiny trap triggers for small little rodents. One final thing you can do that is much harder and takes a lot more skill level and finesse, but it's a good thing to be able to do because you never know when you need a hole in a stick, and that's a hole through. And so usually I will make it in my square reduction, and it's usually nerve-wracking because there's a chance you'll split your stick and you spend all this time on it and then you're going to split it. But basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a hole in the center of this wood all the way through with your knife, which can be challenging. It takes a lot of patience, a lot of time, but it's a good skill to be able to do because there's certain traps that utilize that, and then there's also many times when you want a hole in a piece of wood. I'm sure you can use your imagination and come up with something, whether it be like a lanyard hole for a spoon you carve, or some type of a hole to run line through. There's all sorts of different uses for a hole through a piece of wood. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on that. What I usually start with is I will usually start with the tip of my knife in the center of the wood and just start rotating, kind of like you would with an awl. You don't want to make it too big, but it gives me a little divot. And then just above that, depending on how big I want the hole, I will put another hole or another divot. And then what I will do is I will start removing the material in between. Using the tip of my knife, this is a scenario where you would choke up on your knife. Then I'm just going to start slowly just picking away little pieces of wood until I get a nice hole. And sometimes it will be helpful to move to the other side once you've got parts of the way through, but I don't recommend doing that until you get the tip of your knife through to the other side so you can see where it's at, so your two ends line up. So what I'm doing here is I basically have the tip of my knife in there. Let's see if I can get this. And I'm just slowly rotating it this way, rotating it this way, rotating it this way, working on that end. Then I turn it around and do the same thing. And I'm basically just kind of wiggling it back and forth, working those fibers loose as I create that hole. It's a slow process. But you think people used to do this with stone tools, so surely we can take the time to do it with a modern knife. And as you can see there, I have a hole through. So really it's just working back and forth, both ends of it, and then once you're almost through, you can work to the other side, drill little holes, and then start working from that end. But yeah, that's a hole through. So now I could put a lanyard through there or anything else. That's the most time-consuming process of the whole thing. That takes about as long as the rest of this does. But it's a good skill to have, and then you can hang it on your wall, I guess. So, but that's a tri-stick, and that gives you the ability to practice a lot of different skills all at once. And like I said, you could strip the bark off, use it for cordage. You can use the little shavings and try to make a fire with that. All sorts of different things. But it's a good way to test all your different knives. If you have knives that you take in the woods, I recommend making tri-sticks, see how they do. I realized early on that the knife that I was using for a while wasn't great because I struggled making one of these. Once you get experienced, you can make one of these with just about any knife. I could make one of these with a kitchen knife. But it's best, you know, you don't want something that's adequate, you want something that works. We live in an era where you don't have to necessarily just settle. There's always a great option, and usually for a pretty good price. And I'll go over knife selection and different options in a different video. But that was just basic knife use, knife safety, knife maintenance, And I hope you guys enjoyed it. I appreciate you guys watching, and if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. And until next time, get out in the woods, have some fun, and make some tri-sticks.